You do it without noticing. The body is still under warm water, under blankets, behind the wheel, but the mind quietly leaves. And suddenly, you're not here anymore. You're in a conversation that never happened, saying the words you didn't say, hearing the response you needed to hear. You finally win the argument from years ago. You explain yourself perfectly. You're understood, respected, seen. Or you jump forward into a future moment that hasn't arrived, a speech you might never give, a success that finally proves something, a version of your life where everything lines up, and when the moment breaks, when the water turns cold, the phone buzzes, the traffic light changes, there's a strange emotional echo, relief and disappointment, because for a few seconds that unreal version of life felt more solid than the real one. And this is where people misunderstand what's happening. This isn't casual daydreaming, it's not boredom, it's not imagination wandering aimlessly. What's happening is much more structured than that. These aren't fragments, they're full simulations, with dialogue, with emotional weight, with a clear sense of, this is how it should have gone. You replay confrontations with people who hurt you. You imagine success scenarios where your value is finally undeniable. You build romantic moments with someone you barely know, but deeply feel. You rehearse disasters, not because you want them, but because you're bracing for impact. And none of it is random. These scenarios follow patterns, emotional patterns, unfinished patterns. And here's the first thing that needs to be understood clearly. This isn't a flaw. It's not weakness. It's not avoidance. It's not a failure to be present. It's the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. Simulate. Predict. Prepare. When reality feels uncertain, the mind tries to create certainty, even if it has to build it internally. And this is where the mechanism begins. There's a system in the brain known as the default mode network. It activates when external focus drops, when there's no immediate task demanding attention. Most people experience it as light mental wandering, but for some minds it doesn't wander. It constructs. It builds full internal environments, complete with emotional stakes and narrative logic. And this is where something subtle happens. The brain doesn't distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one as much as we think it does. The same emotional circuits light up, the same stress responses, the same sense of anticipation or relief. So when the external world doesn't offer resolution, the mind creates one. Psychology calls this counterfactual thinking, running alternate versions of reality, not as punishment, not as escapism, but as problem solving. Your mind keeps asking the same question in different forms. What could I have done differently? What should I say if this happens again? What would it feel like if things finally worked out? And this is where the confusion begins. Because on the surface it looks like fantasy, but internally it's closer to rehearsal, a quiet attempt to regain control. When life feels emotionally unresolved, conversations unfinished, identity unvalidated, outcomes unclear, the brain refuses to let go. So it replays, refines, rewrites, not to torture you, but to make sense of something that never fully landed. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the more detailed the scenario becomes, which explains why these inner worlds feel so vivid and why returning to reality can feel like a loss. Because inside those simulations, things finally move the way they're supposed to. But here's what most people never notice. The brain isn't chasing pleasure in these moments. It's chasing closure. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's always leaning forward in time, asking what happens next, what could go wrong, how this ends. So when these fake scenarios appear, they're not random fantasies. They're simulations, the same way a pilot uses a flight simulator, not to escape flying, but to prepare for it. Testing responses, running outcomes, trying to reduce surprise. Inside the imagined conversation, every line is refined. Inside the imagined future, every risk is anticipated. Inside the imagined disaster, every move is rehearsed. On the surface, it looks like overthinking, but underneath, it's the brain trying to build certainty in advance. And this is where something quietly shifts. At first, the scenario is a tool, a rehearsal, a mental dry run, but repetition changes its function. The conversation gets replayed so many times that the real one never happens. The success feels so emotionally complete that effort loses urgency. The hurt is revisited so vividly that it never fully resolves. The simulation stops pointing toward reality and starts replacing it. And this doesn't happen because of laziness or fear. It happens because the brain discovered something powerful. Inside the scenario, there is control. In real life, outcomes are unstable. People misunderstand. Timing is wrong. Words land badly. You can't rewind. You can't edit. You can't guarantee being seen. But inside the imagined world, you control every variable. You choose the words. You shape the reaction. You decide who understands you and how deeply. You become the writer, the director, and the audience at the same time. And if someone has spent years feeling powerless, overlooked, emotionally unheard, that control feels intoxicating. Not because it's fake, but because it's rare. The scenarios become a place where agency finally exists, where meaning finally sticks, where the self feels solid. And none of this is pathological. It's human adaptation. But there's a quiet cost that often goes unnoticed. The emotional system doesn't fully distinguish between simulated experience and lived experience. The feelings are real, even if the situation isn't. So anger generated in imagination lingers in the body. Disappointment forms before reality even unfolds. Expectations harden around scripts that no one else knows exist. And slowly, something subtle happens. The inner world starts to feel more coherent than the outer one. Because the outer world is noisy, unpredictable, unscripted. And the brain, for all its intelligence, is deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. So it retreats toward what it can shape. Not consciously, not deliberately, automatically. And this is where many people get confused. They think the problem is imagination, or distraction, or lack of discipline. But that's not what's driving this. The scenarios aren't trying to entertain you. They're trying to complete something. They appear most often around unfinished emotional loops, unspoken boundaries, unvalidated identities, outcomes that never fully landed. The mind keeps returning to the same scenes because something inside them still feels unresolved. Not intellectually, emotionally, and until that emotional signal changes, the brain keeps simulating. Which is why trying to stop the scenarios rarely works. Because the mind isn't malfunctioning, it's insisting. Insisting that something matters. Insisting that something wasn't fully processed. Insisting that something still needs coherence. And this is the part most people never notice. The scenarios aren't about the future, and they're not really about the past. They're about meaning, about making sense of who you are and where you stand. In situations where reality never gave a clear answer, so the brain creates one, quietly, internally, over and over again, until the feeling finally makes sense. And when that happens, when the scenario dissolves, it doesn't disappear because you forced it away. It fades because it's no longer needed, because the mind got what it was searching for all along, not fantasy, but understanding. There's a subtle distinction hidden inside these scenarios, and most people never notice it. Some imagined scenes are rehearsals, others are shelters. On the surface, they look identical. Same conversation, same future moment, same emotional intensity. But underneath, they serve different psychological roles. When the mind is preparing, the scenario points outward. It exists in relation to something that may actually happen. The brain is mapping responses, anticipating reactions, organizing emotion in advance. But when the mind is protecting, the scenario folds inward. It repeats without resolution. It creates emotional completion without real-world movement. And this is where the difference becomes visible. Preparation eventually releases tension. Protection preserves it. The brain uses both. Not consciously, not strategically, but automatically. Switching between rehearsal and refuge depending on how safe reality feels. And this matters, because the mind doesn't warn you when the shift happens. What begins as practice can quietly turn into avoidance, not because action is impossible, but because the imagined version already delivered the emotional payoff. And once the payoff is received internally, the urgency to face uncertainty externally weakens. This is why some scenarios feel energizing and others feel heavy. Why some fade naturally and others loop endlessly. The looping isn't a failure of discipline. It's a sign that the brain is trying to contain discomfort instead of move through it. And here's something most people miss. The mind doesn't actually want to stay in these scenarios forever. It wants containment. It wants to know there's a boundary between imagination and life. When that boundary is unclear, the scenarios expand. They fill empty moments. They spill into neutral time, because the brain doesn't know where else to put them, which is why awareness changes the relationship, even without force. The moment the mind recognizes the scenario as a process rather than a place, something shifts. The imagination doesn't need to be shut down. It just needs context. And when attention returns to sensation, to weight, temperature, sound, breath, the brain naturally reorients, not through control, but through grounding. This isn't about snapping out of imagination. It's about reestablishing contact with the present moment as something tangible, because sensory input activates a different system than simulation. One is narrative, the other is immediate, and the brain can't fully occupy both at once. So when awareness returns to what's physically here, the imagined world loosens its grip. Not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer the only place coherence exists. And this leads to a quieter, deeper understanding. The mind isn't broken for creating scenarios. It's adaptive. It's trying to protect you from uncertainty, trying to prepare you for impact, trying to give structure where life feels unstructured. The scenarios were never the problem. For many people, they were a refuge during times when reality offered little safety. They provided comfort, meaning, a sense of agency, and maybe they were necessary then, but they were never meant to become a permanent residence. They were meant to be simulations, not substitutes, ways the mind could explore, test, and process before returning to what's real. Because real life is unscripted, unpredictable, often unresolved, but it's also the only place where new information can arrive. And when the mind finally understands that, when it no longer needs to hold everything internally, the scenarios don't disappear dramatically. They simply soften. They become quieter. They take their rightful place as tools of understanding, not destinations. And maybe that realization alone explains more than it seems, because it reveals something simple and strangely relieving. You were never trying to escape life. You were trying to make sense of it. And once that's understood, the mind can finally rest.